Today, we bring you a major news story out of Bangladesh. The former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has been sentenced to death by a special tribunal after being found guilty of crimes against humanity. Her trial and conviction mark a seismic shift in Bangladesh's political landscape, from the rise and dominance of her government, to a massive student-led uprising, to exile, and now to the courtroom verdict. In this video we'll tell the full story: who she is, how events unfolded, what happened in the trial, how the verdict came about, and what it means going forward. For decades, Sheikh Hasina stood as one of the most dominant and influential figures in Bangladesh's political history. Her journey from the daughter of the country's founding leader to a multi-term prime minister was marked by resilience, tragedy, and an iron-fisted style of governance that both captivated and divided the nation. She returned to power in 2009 and maintained her rule for 15 uninterrupted years, during which she oversaw major infrastructure achievements, economic growth, and increased global visibility for Bangladesh. But her years in office also faced mounting criticism from opposition groups, activists, journalists, and international observers who accused her government of tightening control over every major institution, from the judiciary to the police to the Electoral Commission. By the time she entered her final term, the political environment in Bangladesh had already grown tense. Many opposition leaders were imprisoned or in exile, major media houses were under pressure, and dissent was often met with swift punishment. Supporters saw her as a symbol of stability, arguing that her strong leadership had shielded the country from chaos. Critics, meanwhile, felt she had entrenched herself far too deeply, turning democratic processes into mere formalities and concentrating almost absolute authority in the hands of the ruling party. In the background of her political dominance, frustration simmered among the youth. Bangladesh had a rapidly growing young population, many of whom felt disconnected from a government they viewed as outdated and unresponsive to their concerns. Rising unemployment, economic inequality, and allegations of corruption fueled an atmosphere of silent resentment on university campuses and within urban communities. That frustration would later erupt into one of the largest protest movements in the country's history, but in this early phase, it remained mostly a tension beneath the surface, waiting for a trigger. Hasina's leadership style became increasingly characterized by strong central control and zero tolerance for opposition. National security agencies expanded their powers, and critics claimed that surveillance, arrests, and intimidation were used to keep political rivals in check. While her supporters insisted these actions were necessary to maintain peace and order, her opponents argued that Bangladesh was drifting toward a one-party state. Despite this growing divide, Hasina continued to project confidence, holding tightly to her political machinery and maintaining solid influence within the police, military, and bureaucracy. This was the political climate, a nation with accomplishments but also deepening divides, as Bangladesh moved closer to the turbulent year that would change everything. The government appeared unshakable, the ruling party firmly entrenched, and Hasina herself regarded as nearly untouchable. Yet beneath the apparent stability, the pressure was building. Public patience was thinning, the youth were restless, and the gap between the government and its citizens had never been wider. This delicate balance of power, public frustration, and political tension set the stage for the events that would soon unfold, events that would ultimately topple a long-standing leader, send her into exile, and put her on trial for crimes that would shake the entire region. The fragile calm that had rested over Bangladesh finally shattered when student frustration erupted into the open. What began as peaceful demonstrations over government decisions affecting university quotas and job allocations quickly grew into something far larger, a nationwide movement fueled by years of bottled-up anger. Students who felt ignored, unemployed youth who felt abandoned, and ordinary citizens who felt suffocated by tightening government control all found themselves swept into a wave of protest that spread from one campus to the next, then from city centers to rural towns. Within days, Bangladesh was witnessing the largest youth-driven uprising in its modern history. The crowds demanded far more than policy reversals. They voiced frustration at corruption, inequality, and the sense that political freedom had been steadily eroded. Protesters accused the government of silencing dissent, manipulating institutions, and treating the public as if they had no role in their own democracy. Chanting for justice, accountability, and change, the young generation filled the streets with a confidence that shocked a government long accustomed to controlling the narrative. The demonstrations grew at a pace the authorities did not expect. Roads were blocked, university campuses turned into hubs of resistance, and city intersections transformed into symbols of defiance. Social media amplified every moment. Videos of clashes, speeches from student leaders, and scenes of huge crowds chanting for reform spread across the country in real time. The government, which had handled smaller waves of dissent before, suddenly found itself facing a movement too massive to contain through its usual political tactics. As the pressure mounted, the state's response hardened. Security forces were deployed in large numbers, and what had begun as peaceful rallies escalated into chaotic confrontations. Tear gas filled the streets, rubber bullets were fired into crowds, and police charged at demonstrators with batons. But the resistance only intensified. For every group dispersed, more appeared elsewhere. For the first time in years, it looked as though sheer public force was overwhelming the machinery of the state. Then came the turning point, a decision that would later become central to the charges filed against Sheikh Hasina. Security forces escalated from crowd control measures to lethal force. In some areas, witnesses reported the use of live ammunition. Videos allegedly showed helicopters circling protest zones, and drone footage captured security deployments advancing on student strongholds. The death toll began to rise sharply, and reports of injuries and disappearances spread faster than officials could deny them. Within weeks, Bangladesh had descended into a level of violence not seen since its 1971 independence war. Independent estimates reported that as many as 1,400 people were killed during the crackdown: students, bystanders, and sometimes even children caught in the chaos. Hundreds more were injured or reportedly detained. Hospitals overflowed, families searched frantically for missing relatives, and the grief and shock across the nation reached a breaking point. The government insisted it was responding to violent agitators, but many citizens felt they were witnessing repression on a scale the country had never imagined. International human rights groups raised alarms, calling the response disproportionate and deeply concerning. Diplomats issued statements urging restraint, but the streets continued to burn. Within the ruling circle, panic began to grow. The protests were no longer a political inconvenience, they were threatening the very foundations of Hasina's leadership. The situation spiraled beyond the control of the authorities, and the government's attempts at damage control only deepened public anger. Cabinet members grew divided, senior security officials struggled to stabilize the situation, and international pressure mounted rapidly. By August 2024, the government was collapsing under the weight of public fury and global scrutiny. The Awami League's power structure crumbled, and Sheikh Hasina, facing widespread calls for her resignation and fearing for her safety, fled across the border into India. Her sudden departure stunned the nation. After 15 years of near-absolute authority, she had been pushed from power in a matter of weeks. The woman once considered unshakable was now a political fugitive in a neighboring country. Bangladesh was left in a state of shock, grieving, angry, and uncertain. But the fall of the government did not bring closure. It was only the start of a deeper reckoning, one that would eventually lead to courtrooms, tribunals, and the most dramatic verdict in the country's modern history. When Sheikh Hasina fled the country and her government collapsed almost overnight, Bangladesh was thrown into a moment of profound uncertainty. The power vacuum left behind was unlike anything the nation had experienced in recent decades. Streets remained tense, emotions ran high, and families grieving the loss of loved ones demanded justice with a desperation that could no longer be ignored. With the ruling structure gone and the opposition still fragmented, the responsibility of stabilizing the nation fell into the hands of an interim administration created under extraordinary circumstances. The transitional leadership, headed by respected economist and Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, emerged as a neutral figure capable of calming international concerns while promising to rebuild public trust. The new administration faced a daunting task from its first day: heal a country traumatized by the violence, restore functioning institutions, and address the overwhelming demand for accountability. But it quickly became clear that for the Bangladeshi people, justice for the killings during the uprising was not negotiable. Under intense public pressure, the interim government launched a sweeping review of the events surrounding the crackdown. Committees were formed to collect testimonies, examine footage, and review security force orders issued during the protests. The scale of the allegations was massive: widespread killings, excessive use of force, unlawful detentions, and suspected attempts to cover up certain operations. Witnesses described scenes of chaos and brutality that shocked even seasoned observers. Families of victims filled public hearings, recounting the final moments of sons, daughters, husbands, and wives who had gone out to protest and never returned. As evidence piled up, the call to hold former government officials responsible grew louder. Many believed that without a proper legal reckoning, the wounds of the uprising would never heal. Activists, students, and civil society groups marched again, this time demanding formal charges against those who ordered, enabled, or justified the violence. Responding to the growing chorus, the interim administration reactivated and restructured the International Crimes Tribunal, a body originally created years earlier for war crimes trials. This time, its focus shifted squarely to the events of the 2024 crackdown. Prosecutors began assembling a complex case that involved thousands of pages of documents, hours of video evidence, and witness testimonies from survivors, medical workers, and former security personnel. The tribunal's mandate was clear: determine whether the lethal force used during the protests amounted to crimes against humanity, and identify those responsible at the highest levels of government. The investigation stretched across borders. With Sheikh Hasina in exile in India, prosecutors sent formal requests for cooperation, but India offered no indication it would hand her over. Still, the tribunal moved forward. It subpoenaed former ministers, senior police commanders, and intelligence officials. Some fled, some stayed and testified, others denied involvement entirely. Yet the deeper investigators dug, the more the command structure pointed upward, toward the Prime Minister's office, where key decisions about protest response were allegedly made. Every week brought new revelations. Leaked communications hinted at emergency orders authorizing more aggressive tactics. Internal reports suggested that warnings from security advisors about escalating violence were ignored. Former insiders, feeling abandoned by the fallen government, stepped forward with accounts that prosecutors described as essential pieces of the puzzle. The narrative forming inside the tribunal was one of a crackdown not simply gone wrong, but allegedly directed with full knowledge of its potential consequences. Public anticipation grew as the case moved closer to trial. Many saw this moment as a turning point, a chance to redefine justice in a country long marred by political impunity. Supporters of the interim government described the tribunal as a necessary step toward rebuilding trust. Critics, however, warned that the process must remain transparent and free from political revenge. By the time the tribunal formally announced charges against Sheikh Hasina and several high-ranking members of her former administration, Bangladesh had entered a new chapter. The stage was set for one of the most consequential legal battles in its history, a trial that would not only determine the fate of a former prime minister but would test whether the country could truly confront the darkest moments of its past. From the moment the tribunal convened, it was clear that Bangladesh was witnessing a turning point unlike anything in its history. The courtroom became the epicenter of a national storm, a place where anger, grief, political wounds, and long-buried resentments all collided in the open. Security was suffocatingly tight. Roads around the courthouse were sealed off, police checkpoints inspected every vehicle, and riot units stood by as thousands of people gathered outside, their voices merging into a constant, restless roar. Some held pictures of their children who died during the student protests. Others shouted Hasina's name in defiance, insisting the trial was nothing more than political revenge. The air outside shook with chants, arguments, and heartbreak. Inside, the atmosphere was razor tense. The former prime minister's chair remained empty, a stark, almost haunting symbol of her exile across the border. And yet her presence dominated the room. Every document read aloud, every testimony given, every raised voice looped back to her actions, her instructions, her denials. It was as if the entire country was speaking to that empty seat. The prosecution's case unfolded with cold, deliberate weight. They began by revisiting the chaos of the 2024 student uprising, a movement that had started with peaceful demands but erupted into one of the deadliest civilian crackdowns in the nation's modern memory. The prosecutors described days of gunfire echoing across campuses, drones deployed to track student gatherings, armored vehicles rolling through university gates, and bodies piling in makeshift morgues as parents searched frantically for their children. Their argument was that this devastation was not an accident, not a miscalculation, not the result of confused commanders, but the direct consequence of orders originating from Hasina's government. Then came the evidence that shook the courtroom. Internal communications, high-level directives, testimony from officers who claimed they were instructed to use lethal force without hesitation, statements alleging she approved the deployment of military assets against unarmed students, records suggesting she was briefed about casualties and was told that the crackdown was spiraling, yet failed to step in to stop it. The prosecutors argued that she not only allowed the violence but encouraged it, privately expressing frustration with the protests and demanding that order be restored by any means necessary. Survivors and witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling as they relived trauma. A young man with a surgical brace around his spine described being shot as he tried to pull a friend behind a wall. A mother recounted how her son went out to join what he believed was a peaceful march and never came home. A former police officer, now under protection, described the fear he felt when ordered to disperse students with live ammunition, and the guilt he carried since. But the defense fought back fiercely. They insisted the trial was illegitimate, orchestrated by political opponents who sought to erase Hasina from Bangladesh's future. They argued that the prosecution's documents lacked proper verification, that digital recordings were unreliable, and that chain of command responsibility was far more complex than the tribunal claimed. They reminded the court that Hasina, from exile, denied all wrongdoing and called the proceedings a politically motivated attempt to destroy her legacy. Her lawyers argued that chaos on the ground often spiraled beyond central control, and that isolated decisions by security commanders were now being pinned on her to satisfy public anger. Still, the tribunal pressed on. Judges sifted through thousands of pages of evidence, witness statements, intelligence assessments, and government records. Day after day, new testimonies surfaced, some damning, some contradictory, all emotionally charged. Throughout the hearings, political tension outside the courtroom continued to escalate. On some days, explosions rattled nearby streets. On others, clashes between supporters and protest groups forced police to fire tear gas and batons. The country felt like it was on the brink of something irreversible. Finally, after weeks of proceedings, the judges delivered their findings. In a decision that stunned the nation and the world, they declared the evidence overwhelming. They concluded that Hasina had incited violence, approved lethal measures, and bore responsibility for the deaths and injuries of hundreds of students. They ruled that she had not only failed to prevent the massacre but had compounded it by refusing to hold any of the perpetrators accountable afterward. The courtroom fell into chaos as the sentence was read: death. Some families of victims cried tears of relief and grief at once. Others collapsed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Supporters of Hasina shouted in fury. Outside, anger erupted in the streets, some celebrating the verdict as long overdue justice, others condemning it as a dark moment in the nation's political history. And in exile far across the border, the former Prime Minister learned of her fate not from a courtroom, but from the news. A leader once among the most powerful in South Asia now confronting a verdict that had changed everything. The moment the judge's final words echoed through the courtroom, Bangladesh seemed to split open. The death sentence spread through Dhaka faster than news could travel, carried by trembling voices, frantic phone calls, live streams, and television bulletins that interrupted every program. Within minutes, the streets were flooded, not just with people but with emotion so raw that even seasoned observers could barely describe it. Outside the tribunal, crowds surged like a wave breaking against the courthouse gates. Some families of the victims knelt on the ground, clutching pictures of their children, crying as though a weight they had carried for more than a year had finally begun to lift. Others lit candles, chanting prayers with shaking voices. In stark contrast, Hasina's supporters erupted in fury. They tore down barricades, shouted that the trial was a sham, and accused the interim government of pushing the country into a political abyss. Fights broke out. Police fired tear gas to push the crowds back. Sirens wailed through the city. Dhaka became a city on edge, tense, buzzing, trembling. The army was deployed to several districts as reports of clashes spread. In some neighborhoods, supporters lit tires on fire, blocking major roads. In others, students marched in triumph, holding banners that read "Justice at last." Nowhere was calm. Nowhere was untouched. Across the country, reactions unfolded with the same intensity. In Chittagong, demonstrations lasted long into the night. In Rajshahi, angry crowds stormed government buildings. In Sylhet, people gathered near the central square to pray for the souls of the students who had died. Even rural towns, once removed from national politics, found themselves divided, neighbors arguing in tea stalls, markets closing early, local leaders calling urgent meetings to prevent violence. Internationally, the shockwave was immediate. Statements poured in from foreign governments, human rights organizations, and global institutions. Some called the verdict a historic moment of accountability. Others condemned the death sentence as unacceptable, arguing that even a harsh conviction should not lead to execution. Human rights groups urged Bangladesh to reconsider the punishment. Regional powers watched closely, aware that the decision would reshape South Asian politics. World news anchors spoke with visible disbelief, repeating the same line. A former prime minister, once one of the most dominant figures in the region, had been sentenced to death. Inside Bangladesh's political elite, panic rippled beneath the surface. Allies of the former prime minister feared they were next. Some went into hiding. Others tried to flee the country. Rumors spread that members of her old inner circle were being placed under surveillance. At the same time, supporters of the interim government insisted that justice was long overdue, that the nation had been living under fear, intimidation, and unchecked authority for too long. Meanwhile, in India, where Hasina remained in exile, her reaction was swift and unyielding. She released a statement calling the verdict a weapon of political vengeance, and denouncing the tribunal as illegitimate. She declared that she would fight the sentence through international courts and insisted that history would prove her innocent. But beneath her defiance, the reality was stark. Returning to Bangladesh now meant walking toward an execution chamber. The interim government, aware that the country was vibrating with tension, addressed the nation late that night. In a solemn speech, they urged citizens to remain calm, insisted that the trial had been conducted lawfully, and called the verdict a promise fulfilled to the families of those students whose lives had been lost. But their words did little to ease the tremors running through the streets. People were too angry, too heartbroken, too overwhelmed to listen. As the night deepened, the streets of Dhaka glowed with burning barricades and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Helicopters circled overhead. In some districts, curfews were announced. In others, young activists held vigils, lighting candles along the sidewalks in remembrance of those killed. There was grief, yes, but also pride, rage, fear, hope, and uncertainty blending into a single volatile atmosphere. By dawn, Bangladesh had entered a new chapter. The country was awake not just from sleep, but from the long, painful chapter that had led to this moment. The verdict had settled nothing. Instead, it had ripped the nation open, revealing divisions that would take years to heal. Across the world, leaders and analysts watched carefully, knowing that the fallout from this decision would shape the region's politics far beyond that single courtroom. And somewhere across the border, in a guarded residence far from home, a former prime minister sat in front of a glowing screen, watching her country erupt in reaction to the sentence that had changed her destiny forever. After the courtroom's gavel fell and the death verdict against Sheikh Hasina was officially declared, the repercussions rippled far beyond Dhaka's streets. Diplomatically, the decision provoked a tense and delicate balancing act. Neighboring India, home to Hasina in exile, found itself at the eye of a political hurricane. Bangladesh's interim government immediately made a formal request, demanding Hasina's extradition under the existing treaty. Their message was blunt: handing her over was both a justice imperative and a legal commitment. Hindustan Times. India's response, however, was cautious. The Ministry of External Affairs expressed that New Delhi had noted the tribunal's verdict and emphasized its readiness to engage constructively with all stakeholders, underscoring its concern for stability, peace, and democratic processes in Bangladesh. Livement +2 The Indian Express +2 The statement was careful. It avoided outright compliance with Dhaka's extradition demand, signaling a diplomatic tightrope walk between neighborly ties and Hasina's presence on Indian soil. Hasina, despite the sentence, refused to back down. From her base in India, she denounced the tribunal as rigged and politically motivated. The Economic Times she accused the interim government, led by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, of using the judiciary as a weapon to eliminate her and suppress the Awami League's influence. The New Indian Express she insisted she had been denied a fair trial, that she wasn't permitted to choose her own lawyer, that her defense was marginalized, and that key evidence was either ignored or manipulated. BDNews24.com Her rhetoric was fierce and urgent. She framed her struggle not just as legal but existential, a fight for her party's survival. Meanwhile, the tribunal's chief prosecutor publicly defended the judicial process, calling the verdict an affirmation that Bangladesh could hold high-stakes trials while upholding international legal standards. The business standard with that, the government sought to legitimize the tribunal's work as more than just political retribution, though many outside observers remained skeptical. International human rights organizations added another layer of tension. Amnesty International, in particular, criticized the death sentence as a grave mistake. For them, while accountability was necessary, the death penalty was the ultimate cruel, degrading, and inhuman punishment. Amnesty International they expressed deep concern about whether the trial met fair trial standards, citing the speed of proceedings, the in absentia nature of the trial, and alleged limitations on Hasina's ability to mount a robust defense. In the broader diplomatic sphere, the ruling raised alarm about regional stability. Analysts pointed to the verdict as a turning point. If Bangladesh was willing to issue a death sentence to a former prime minister, what precedent did that set? Some countries, especially in South Asia, watched nervously, worried about the implications for democratic norms, judicial independence and political retribution. The long-standing relationship between India and Bangladesh was suddenly at risk of further deterioration, with New Delhi under pressure from both its own public and Dhaka's demands. At the same time, political fault lines within Bangladesh deepened. The interim government, praising the verdict as a testament to rule of law, faced rising expectations and urgent questions. Could they truly hold future trials fairly? Could they navigate a path toward reconciliation? Meanwhile, Hasina's supporters were not just angered, they felt betrayed, abandoned and determined. They warned that her sentencing could radicalize sections of her base. On the other side, families of protest victims saw vindication, though they also feared that the verdict might spark further violence. Ultimately, Section 6 painted a picture of a nation and a region in flux. The verdict closed one chapter of the crisis but also opened many more. With Hasina in exile, political tensions unresolved and international pressure mounting, Bangladesh now faced a fragile future. One shaped not just by retribution, but by the deep challenge of rebuilding trust, legitimacy, and democratic stability.